the University of Sharjah and American University of Sharjah, and the co-founder of Architecture and Other Things.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, good. No need. Thank you. First thing is thanks for Amman Design Week. All of you guys, if I start naming, I'll miss someone. So thank you for having me here. The talk is called Making Almost Natural Things and Spaces, and there's this cheeky subtitle which I'll get to later, which is Where Did You Find This? So just keep that in mind. The talk will be cut in 3 portions, 2 very short ones and a slightly longer one. The first is, can you hear me? You can't hear me. Okay, can you hear me? You can hear me, okay. The first portion is just setting out a thesis, telling you what all of this is about. The second portion is why this thesis happened, or the background behind the thesis. And the third portion is the stuff that responds to the thesis. So the thesis is kind of 2 observations, or 2.5 observations, which is 1, architecture versus nature. In how we produce architecture and in how we teach it also, there's always a X versus Y. There's always an othering of nature. So I don't know how it is here, but in a typical North American curriculum, teaching about nature is either site planning, very kind of dry, or it's kind of green building practices. It's always something that is other. And the second observation is there was this promise of digital fabrication and precision. And the funny thing that I tell my digital fabrication colleagues is I'm sick and tired of seeing digitally fabricated things get banged into place. Because they're supposed to be fast and precise, but it always doesn't happen. So I'm kind of responding in my work to this othering of nature and to the failed promise of digital fabrication and precision. And this has taken, and it kind of continues to, 3 forms. One is kind of scavenging, looking for stuff, and putting them together. The other one is false growing. So I have a problematic relationship with that form. And the third one is where it kind of is, and you'll see images, which is kind of misfit assembly is what I'm calling it. So where these come from, right? The obvious one, this architecture versus nature thing. Anthropocene is a fancy word for climate change. I mean, we have Meal here doing something that responds to climate change, and a lot of us in Amman Design Week have this kind of relationship to climate change in one shape or form. So it's kind of in the air. And the way we respond to climate change as architects is either through, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, things like LEED, green building practices, which is very, the problem with LEED is that it flattens how buildings look like with ethics. So if your building doesn't look like it's a LEED building, you're an unethical architect. And that's problematic because what it results in is homogeneity. So this is kind of a LEED-driven competition for a zero-waste house, and they all kind of look the same, and they all look LEED-y. The second way we respond to architecture and environment is through scavenging. I don't know if you guys know this, like Star Wars. So the problem with scavenging is that it's living off of the grid, and it's kind of silly because we should use technology. Not like LEED, but we should use technology. And the third relationship to nature is kind of the imitation, making things look like dragonfly things. So these are like the 3 things that I'm rebelling, quote unquote, against. So buildings, facades that look like bones. The second critique, the background behind the second critique, is kind of Mies. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. It's kind of like a high modernist project. And the problem with it is that there's always this othering of nature. I'm either inside or I'm outside. So these are and it's also like the high point of precision in architecture. I'll move on. So my response is to be a little bit more messy. And faster, because why not? Because we just need to be building much faster and potentially much messier, and if something can come out of that. This is an artist that I kind of look at a lot, Richard Long, who does these ginormous 10-meter paintings with mud. You can find this on YouTube in like 5 minutes, but it still is controlled. So he's kind of in control of the messiness that he has. And the other kind of positive thing is that it's off nature, but you're not sure. You go to a gallery setting, and is this mud, is this paint? I don't know. So this is just a point of reference. So where we are, and there's a point that I need to make when I say we, most of the work that you see is either myself and collaborators, myself and partners, or myself and students. So that's where the we comes from. Just to, if I name everyone, that'll be just the lecture. So where we are is kind of taking the me's and making it a little bit more messier, more natural. This is one of the first projects with my first collaborators, Mobius, where it's kind of is this scavenging in the three expressions that I've talked about, the scavenging, the growing, and the assembly. Most of this is kind of like gallery projects. So the first project was, what can we do with natural material? That's essentially seed pods. Can we use them as a building skin kind of situation? So we took this, we found the seed pod, we dried it, we wet it, we dried it, and we kind of assembled it on a prefabricated thing. This is like 7 years, I don't know, 6 years ago. It feels old. I feel old now. But what it gave us, so there are problems with it because it is a little bit silly in the sense that it doesn't particularly use technology to the maximum that I'm kind of arguing we should. But what it does give is this kind of new sense that, and especially working in the region, it's kind of like a slap in the face. I don't know, again, it'd be interesting to listen to your thoughts here. There's an over fascination with pattern in the region. So what this kind of does is it upends this and becomes an interest in texture, which is acultural, whereas pattern, because of our visual cultural heritage, has a lot of connotations. So texture starts to become a little bit unknown. So that what is this becomes a question. It's not an Arab or Islamic thing. At the same time that I was doing these, I was starting to kind of like also look at these. I mean, it came really from this guy. So this guy was the first one to kind of tell us what to do. So I've digitally started to look at things, printing them, and here's where this kind of, where did you find this started to come? Because if I show these things and people don't believe that they're made, and I used to hate that. No, I made this. Don't ask me where you found it. And eventually I started to own it. I'm like, that's actually an interesting thing. And that's where this sort of, a lot of the stuff, and you could see some of the things that we have in the show talk about. It's like, what is this? Did you make this? Did you find this? I mean, I remember last year, and I'll show you, one of the things that I showed last year in Amman Design Week, people, and I just like overhearing people, and they go like, I can hear them in Arabic saying, hi min Petra. Like, no, this isn't from Petra, like I made it, but it's kind of that, and you'll see that in a second. So again, a lot of these kind of iterations. At the same time, I'm also having to kind of like develop some digital skills, etc. So a lot of these guys work hand in hand. When I first did these, in my mind, these were big things because I was naive and much younger. And in not having a large 3D printer, you go for all right, I don't have a large 3D printer. I can do maybe some furniture with this at just a next jump in scale. In not having a large 3D printer, you use what we refer to as like a cheap man 3D printer, which is essentially layering. And I don't mean this negatively. But when you go there from this, which also has this like, where did you find this feel, to a layering situation, it kind of reveals itself in an odd way. Like, okay, I know this is MDF layered, right? It's just, it takes away some of the surprise that kind of we're arguing for. And it's very heavy and very slow and all of these things. And then there was a eureka moment. These are like the Petra rocks. They're not. I've never, only yesterday in all my life did I go to Petra. So they're not. But this was a moment between these guys. And this, I know you guys don't see. I keep pressing, but you guys don't see the laser. Between this, which is in the same critique that I've given, which is like digital fabrication and precision and layering and like, oh, if something is offset, disaster, towards these guys, which they use technology, so routing styrofoam, so it's a machine that you give it layers and it just cuts out, so it becomes a hollow mold, and casting a resin, so it's a very quick, so these guys take a day, right? Whereas this thing maybe takes a week. And at one point I gave up, clearly, like it should do more, and I'm like, I'm done, I don't want to do this. But this, in the same way as that Senna pod thing was a revelation, this was also a revelation in that, all right, this is truly, where did you find this? And it truly does blur this made human-made versus natural thing that it becomes an aesthetic that we kind of look at a lot. And it's quick, and it's fast. And there's also this value, because of the chemical reaction that happens between hot resin being poured into a porous material, other things happen. So like the crack was not supposed to, this vertical crack wasn't in my digital model. So there becomes kind of like a game as opposed to the lead situation, which I referred to earlier, which is I make this and I know exactly what's going to come out. So there's a bunch of these. Finally, I got the guy that is not as heavy as the MDF, just for scale. It doesn't show a lot, but again, it starts to kind of like, I don't know what this is, right? We did a couple of these, but there was a problem here that eventually we realized that, and I mean, it's kind of nice to actually be here because this is the exact opposite in a positive way, where the built architecture, whatever it is, needs to come in pieces, right? And these guys really, again, without a large, ginormous 3D printer, cannot be made in the process that I'm making them. So even though we're doing these, we have this kind of like, how do I scale this? I really don't know how to scale this. Yeah, I can cast it at that scale, but it's going to stay there forever and it's going to not move. Right? And it's impossible to a certain extent. In that sense, there was a moment when in the testing of these guys where one of them didn't really come out straight. So I had to add a leg to it. And it was like just a simple piece of rebar. And that's kind of, again, one of these moments where, okay, then these things can come in parts. That stays at the back of our mind somewhere. It doesn't come for a while, for a couple of years, really. So this is kind of like 5 years. It's a bit slow. Regardless. So that being said, there was a huge fascination with texture at that point. And a lot of this work, I can tell you this is anything, and you would believe me. I've convinced people this is honey. I've convinced people this is salt. I don't know. Depending on where I am, if I'm in Texas, oh, this is from the Grand Canyon. This has actually happened. If I'm in Amman, this is from Petra. If I'm in the UAE, this is coral stone. And people are like, sure, this is coral. Right? So there was, and this is the moment where the where did you find this became ours or mine. Like, I like this. Where did I find this? So this was supposed to be a brick, right? So this was the relationship between these growing pieces to a brick. So this is a brick. It's the same one. There was this thing about the brick that it has an inside and outside that is heterogeneous. It's different. That also became important, whereas these guys were not. They were the same, and that also doesn't translate. I mean, to be clear, I'm an architect by training. I teach undergraduate architecture education. The dream is to build this, right? Somewhere down the line, right? So even though we're doing these things at this scale, there's always a thought of how can we make these inhabitable. So the heterogeneity in this became a little bit interesting. It stays at the back of our mind also, and it'll come back again. But they were supposed to be bricks, and the idea of like, okay, maybe I can actually make fake coral bricks without having to look for bleached coral, which is a whole different problem, etc., etc. Trying it at different things, getting porosities within the brick. Can the brick be both transparent and not, etc.? Which I think, if I continue, got us to the first thing that was made for Amman Design Week last year, which is this transparent version of the brick with legs, so the transparent chair brick. However, these will come back in some way, shape, or form. The transparency versus the opacity, the beginning of heterogeneity or the beginning of difference, whereas most of what you've seen before that was you look at it and it's one thing. It's just either thick or it's thin or it's seed pod, etc. But you don't say no when someone gives you some stuff. Even though I'm fighting this and I want to make it out of real parts, the whole sort of the texture, spatial thing, if someone donates a bunch of foam and time on a 5-axis machine, you will not tell them no. It's just as a advice, or not, I don't, depending on how you look at it. So we got, no, it's not BI yet, sorry. So we got this in Dubai Design Days, I think, Design Days Dubai, Design Days Dubai, Dubai Design Days, Dubai Design Days. We got a 3 meter by 3 meter by 3 meter block of space, and we got a 27 1 by 1 by 1 block of foam donated, and some time on a 5-axis machine. So it's kind of a chance to do something bigger. Luckily, when the foam stuff happened, I was in the kind of, this is the first teaching image I showed, just again, because I said this earlier, most of this is really students, like pumping my brain. So we were looking at digital ways of producing these kinds of things. This sort of not one thing situation. It's complex visually, it has lines, it has volumes, it has textures. It's, again, the word I've been using with heterogeneous, just a fancy word for it, just different, right, in the same object. That you can't look at it and say it's a clicker, right? You gotta like walk around with it for a second. So students were kind of exploring these things digitally. And then I haven't said this, but there's always in all of this is like digital physical feedback, right? They're all part of my roles day to day is kind of to teach students modeling, advanced modeling, some computation. So it's kind of an exercise. It also helps the students because one thing I've learned over the last, I don't know, close to a decade of teaching, I feel old, is to learn a software, there are 3 things. You need someone to kind of show you something, because it's really scary to open a tool and begin from scratch. And I've learned this about myself is I don't like the YouTube learning. It's not interactive enough. So you need someone to show you something. You need a project to work on, so excuses, give them a project. And you need to kind of fool around. So when you're stuck, you fool around and you do something. And then someone shows you more, and you give them another project, and you fool around more, and it just avalanches and becomes bigger. So students were looking at things like that, which was very helpful to me. Again, other models, lines versus textures, etc. And because we didn't have a budget, we just had the foam and the space and the machine, and we didn't really want to spend money on it. We had this machine laying, which is a handheld wire cutter. And the cheapest thing we can buy is some spray paint. What can we do with this, right? Just as a simple solution. So we started looking at this kind of situation. Block of foam, I can cut it, I can spray it, and these things cut. It doesn't really show in the image, but solid, if I use a normal grid and spray it, it starts to dissolve a little bit. So play with grids. If I use a differentiated grid, what happens? If I don't use the simple scooping mechanism, this is by hand, right? If I don't use a simple, yes, I can get a robot to do it, but that costs money, right? And it's time and, whereas what I'll show you was finished in a day. So we just looked at this, and again, it's this messy thing. It reminds us of, if you guys you remember, the big mud paintings that really like take 5 minutes, which is kind of interesting. So we just played with this, we played with color, and then we kind of began to think about it at a large scale. Here's where the image of the broken brick that has the black and the texture comes up. So there's this inside versus outside that kind of somehow got scaled up conceptually and inverted. So we kind of created a box with things on the inside. Just a couple of fabrication shots for those just come like from an educational point of view. So you got glued actually pieces of foam. So you can see a seam here. Another one there. So even though it looks massive, it's really made out of multiple pieces. So at least that appeases us in wanting to actually accept that architecture comes in pieces. Again, so this ginormous block gets kind of routed out. We could have made this, just as a note, we can make that texture that I've kind of shown you on the small blocks through the CNC router, but it takes more time. And for guys like these who are essentially a production situation, time is money, right? So they gave us a limited amount of time. So the small scale stuff we had to find a way to do. this thing becomes that. The blue on the outside is just reinforcement because it's still foam, so we gotta like reinforce it. It's basically fiberglass and resin just to give it a little bit of lateral rigidity. Just a couple of images. So that column on the top left is that piece in the bottom left. Yeah, sorry, bottom left. So eventually, in a couple of days, they gave us this, and we need to come in and rethink this inside outside, right? That broken piece of brick we wanted to kind of bring back. And we just inverted it, because if you remember the broken piece of brick, it was smooth on the inside and dark and textured on the outside. But if it's a spatial thing, it made sense to kind of invert it and put the texture on the inside. So I don't know if you guys can see, but you can still see the seams that are there because of the multiple pieces of the 27 pieces of foam that essentially we started with. And that becomes this, which is just a couple of days, 3 people with a handheld wire cutter. And carpal tunnel syndrome, eventually, like your wrists start to hurt. I'll show you how that happened. I just kind of, a lot of this is kind of like revealing what seems unknown. So the way this really happens is blue chalk. So the first hour and a half is we start in 3 people, each one of them starts in a corner, and we just have a blue chalk, and we start to draw circle patterns at different kind of gradients. Again, we could have done this digitally, and it's pretty easy to kind of deploy digitally, but it will take an enormous amount of time on the machine. So 3 people just drawing for a couple of hours, and then it also gives us the time to kind of do the outside at the same time. So someone else is doing the outside, which we wanted kind of the difference. And I don't know if you guys can see, so this is without anything. We start to like scoop it out with the handheld wire cutter. Scoop out a little bit more using some spray. So we scoop out and then we spray, because the scooping is very rigid and you can start to perceive pattern, but we've already kind of said we've rejected an idea of pattern. We don't want people walking in and thinking, oh, Alhambra Mosque kind of situation, right? This is kind of the red line for us, the kind of regional interpretation of things. So what the spray paint does is kind of melts it a little bit. You can still perceive, you squint your eyes and you can still see, but it kind of like disappears. So anyways, this thing goes to the show, which is a whole different problem. No one should do this ever. And it goes back to this idea that we want to figure out how to make things in pieces, because this was really untenable, right? Yeah, we can do it for a 3x3x3, and I can stay overnight for a day, right? But it's unsustainable as a practice. A couple of images of the final result, right? So this is, and what's nice about this machine, this small handheld machine, is you can shape the wire, right? So you can make it big, and you can squeeze the wire, if you guys remember. It's just a thin steel wire that gets heated. So you can get really thin things. So on the screen, what you guys see, this is probably double the actual size. All right, so just a couple of shots of that. So people don't believe that this is foam. Oh, this is coral. And I'm standing there. And this happens here too. No one, like I'm standing there and I have a tag and I'm telling them, this is not coral, this is actually foam. No, you don't know what you're talking about. It says my name on the thing. But we've owned this, right? Eventually, it became part of the charm for us. I mean, we had an interaction where Cindy was freaking out because we sent them some cracked stuff. And my response was, great, don't worry. And if it cracks a little bit more, that's better, right? And I can hear, I'll show you the images, but people think it's some other, like, oh, this is candle, hada shama'. It's not. We'll get to that. Sorry, I digress. Again, just the last piece. Again, so this is the small brick piece scaled up and inverted. The small brick with the black wedge that's been cut out. It looks like a cake with a wedge cut out. It's still a problem, right? Yeah, it's a step forward, but it's still a problem. As in, yes, we scaled up, but taking things on gigantic trucks isn't the right solution, for me at least. A year later, we were given Again, someone gives you a truckload of stuff, you don't say no. This is just advice. So BIA, which is a waste management company in Sharjah, meaning they just gather, it's a recycling company. And one of the things that they recycle is recycled rubber tires. So they take the rubber tire, they take the steel out of the rubber tire. I don't know what happens to the steel, but the rubber tire gets shredded into crumb rubber, which is what they use for children's playground tiles, fake football grounds. If you have anyone who plays football at home, they come back and it's just everywhere at home. So it's that kind of stuff. And you could see some of it in the show. So they gave us literally a ton of this. And I mean 1,000 kilograms. So we started to look at what we can do with this. And they gave us a mandate this time, and this is great. Like, this is the first time anyone gives me a mandate, meaning we want you to figure out how to extend the material into a furniture piece, right? They've been doing these industrial tiles, but they've kind of they're doing the research on it of, is it healthy, is it not healthy? So at the same time that they're actually doing that research about the chemicals that are in it, they're thinking, in case that the research works, can we use it as a furniture piece? So we just, why not? We'll take the ton and we will use it. So we've played a little bit on a small scale. So that's kind of the rubber in the top left. You can even get it in colors, right? So if you see these tiles, sometimes they're colored. We just put a powder pigment and you mix it, right? And that's kind of where the colors come from. So it's a pretty simple solution that we started with, which is we've got a box, and you put the rubber in it, you put a binder in it, some kind of glue, and then it comes out, and depending on how you finish it, it comes out. So this is a couple of examples. And because of their mandate, meaning they wanted a functional piece of furniture, we kind of give them a functional piece, I think a functional piece of furniture. So I'll show you in scale in a second. So just a couple of pieces, depending on how you finish it, it kind of even extend its visual appearance. It's no longer, one of the things that we added to their mandate is we don't want it to look like rubber tire or recycled rubber tire. We don't want people to assume that it was at one point a crumb rubber. So again, people walking around the show very confidently had a concrete. Okay, it's whatever you want, but it's whatever you want. Especially with the white one, had a concrete, like it's 100%. We've kind of accepted that, right? Where did this come from, or what is this? It's unclear. We're kind of happily playing with it. This one's also had a concrete, like just done. All right, just an image for scale. And I haven't had time to kind of document this yet, but this is the piece in Amman Design Week, which is really the same. It just formally looks closer to the earlier work because we didn't have a clear mandate of it needs to really be this most super functional piece of concrete, piece of furniture. And it also mixes some of the earlier process. So CNC routed foam, just buying foam sheets, 10 centimeter, giving it a digital model, hollowing it out, and then so you could see, you can. This is not the right image, but if you go to the show, that square hole is essentially the leg, right? So just dump some rubber in. And it doesn't take a day. It takes a little bit more than a day, but it finishes fast. So I think this finishes the uncomfortable part of the presentation for me from a conceptual point of view, meaning none of this comes in parts. And I don't know how you guys took it off the crate, right? Someone did, or if 10 people did, but it did, right? But that's problematic. And like, I had to write an email about where to hold it from, and then that's a problem, right? So going back to that diagram that I showed earlier of kind of taking the Mies precision, prefabricated elements, and kind of expanding that times a million. Just none of this is linear, so some of the projects are ahead of the other projects, but I'm presenting it like it's linear. Just kind of, I think that's healthy for you guys to kind of rethink how to present the work. So we were, again, BIA, given at this point, not the crumb rubber, but the actual tiles. They had tiles in stock, 60 by 60 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters. We tried to work with the tile as a tile as a stacking thing didn't really give us much. So the solution that we had was get the tile and just shred it into strips, which is really precipitated from, like, it comes from this diagram. So we did that. We kind of analyzed its bending. We put that into a digital model. Okay, so this tile at this density, because it also comes in density, so we found the right one and kind of studied it, how it bends, etc., and put it into a digital model. And kind of what would it do if it kind of like bends in this? And then that digital model essentially became this piece, which again, it's at the scale of a gallery pavilion. It doesn't really do more, but it does start to give us this sort of, could this be actually a panel, right? Could this be a thick facade panel? Honestly, we haven't gone there, but when we were putting this together, it's like, what could this actually be as a building system, right? And what we also like about it is that everything in this, so this has been, I mean, conceptually what we like about it is that it's been dismantled and put up 3-4 times. And except for the first time, we weren't there. In fact, I just suddenly realized, oh, it's in China. No one told me, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing, meaning it's pretty obvious. Just so you know, series of ribs, sheets that have the cross-section holes in it, and just poke, right? So it kind of, that seems to me like a positive move forward in our critique, in the world that we've set for ourselves, in kind of, because I just saw someone asking someone, how did this come together, right? So that's exactly where that point is, like, what is this? Like, I don't know what, I mean, once you get up close to it, you touch it, you realize, oh, I know what this is. But it's one of these kind of like aha moment for us, like, okay, we can make things out of 1 million pieces. And just put it in an IKEA-style brochure, and someone goes and resolves it. So maybe there's a patent pending, I don't know. So just an image of how it's made. There's a couple of tricks you can realize, like there's a seam, so like we just hide the seam. The seam between the ribs is kind of like unseemly. Just a couple of, the problem with it, just from a point of view, what we haven't resolved yet is that I don't show you pictures of the inside because like, I mean, that's how it looks on the inside. Really, like that's a close-up shot of you looking at things poking you, which maybe at that scale doesn't work. So I don't know how it might work at a larger scale where maybe potentially there's less of them, so it becomes actually a light filtering element and an insulation element, because we've been told that it actually is a good heat insulator from like a heat gain situation. So there is a world that we're looking at there. All right. Something interesting happens when you start looking at work in a certain way, is that you start looking at, so when we were doing the Petra-looking stuff, everything I look at is like, the only thing I see, it's kind of like a blinded horse, the only thing you see is Petra-looking stuff around you, right? So, oh, look at this, it looks like bone. Oh, look at this, it looks like that. And when you kind of switch that, you start to only see things that are made out of multiple stuff. So this is an actual natural thing that we've stumbled upon. Like it's on the street. And what's kind of interesting about it is it does have this, it's made out of multiple pieces that, I don't know, nature does its job, that glue into each other, and it has difference. So the positive model here, and this is just a model, a conceptual model, right? And the positive thing here versus this is that there's difference. So there's thicker elements and thinner elements, which might actually scale up architecturally. It might become real. Student work. So great, we found this. Student work, give them basically an exercise in making shelters out of similar elements that repeat 1 million times. Some of them are the same element. Again, some of them are the same elements. Some of them are similar elements, right? So the thick and the thin comes together. Again, like I have a role in this, which is I've got to teach them how to model, advanced model, some coding, etc. Like there's what I found from a teaching point of view is that just giving them the tool doesn't give result. They don't know how to respond to it, but actually giving them a conceptual framework forces them, so no, this thing cannot look like bones. It needs to kind of appear to be assembled, gives them a constraint. So there's a couple of these. And these are happening, again, these are happening in seminars. They're not happening in actual studio. So it's a bit looser, meaning the goal is a technical skill earned, and the conceptual stuff is a sprinkle on top. Whereas in studio, the goals are much more restricted. Like we have a responsibility to make them be employable in the world, right? So somehow these things overlap. Just a couple of these. Until one of the students, again, I'm just eye candy. At a house scale sometimes, right? So can this be a house? Can it maybe be out of like multiple elements? I'm just kind of showing you these things. Until one of the students two students simultaneously bit on this. And that's kind of like a moment, oh, I'm going to bite on this. The student is biting on it, so I'm going to sort of bite back. So this is one student who's actually also exhibiting the black folded thing. Because if you guys have seen it inside, if you haven't, go. It's at the back slightly. It's at a big shelter. Kind of challenged me by saying I don't want to do it at I don't want to do this because that's what it's going to end up as just an image. And yeah, I've learned a couple of skills. I want to do this because I want you to force me to model it physically, right? So she started to kind of think about it in those ways, meaning how can I assemble these things actually, where most of this is just image, right? It's just to really actually come and construct this would require 10 layers before it can become even conceivable. So that was student number one who bit. At the same time, I was something else kind of like from a teaching point of view. So this is me now. You kind of create the digital environment for them, meaning here is the tool, here is 6 ways you can use the tools, here is 6 parameters you can play with. So this is me giving them the basic of the tool, and that's kind of where they end up in multiple places, right? So at the same time, I was kind of doing these things, essentially class prep, right? I need to teach them something. Let me just kind of figure out a workflow for them. A student bit, again, and he kind of decided to take it he said, would you work with me on this? I know you're interested in this. I know you don't have time because you don't have time because life. Let's work on this together. So he's kind of saying, we want to make a collection of these at furniture scale before we do it at shelter scale or pavilion scale. So we started kind of not doing furniture purposely. Like, we're not going to do furniture. Let's just see what comes out of this. But at the scale of chair. So things that are actually not furniture. And through doing this, we've come up with this kind of, it also helps in this narrative to know that I also teach the structures class, which is a technical class, statics and diagrams and calculations. We've come to like, okay, let's use a structural logic that is cheap and simple, which is 3 sticks working with each other. So this is just 3 sticks, no glue, kind of supporting each other. So that was kind of the aha moment, that we don't need the glue. The ones that are in the show, so you see similar ones of these in the show, they're kind of more rigid because of shipping. We're just worried that if they come here and they come in pieces and no one's here to kind of put them together, we don't know what to do. Although, yes, we could have made an instruction, right? There's that critique. So we got here, realized we can 3D scan for free. We don't need to buy a $5,000 3D scanner, take 1 million photos, put it in the software, and this is what the stickers are, just so that the software recognizes these things. And we have a 3D model. So this was the first one we scanned, but what we were scanning was separate pieces, not the full thing. So we scan it, we model them, so we get the pieces, we model them, we run them through like a quick analysis. What happens if someone sits on them? Nothing really happens. So we move forward. Again, at the same time, so these are scanned, and then they're cut and assembled and stood on. This was the smallest scale. Again, so this is kind of like the process. We find it in pieces, and we scan them, and we kind of put them together. I can arrange them, I can sit on them, and nothing really happens. But they're not really furniture. I mean, at that point, we've crossed the threshold, and like, okay, Amman Design Week is in a week. So like, we need to make furniture. And I'm receiving emails. At one point, Amex was supposed to come yesterday, right? So this is kind of just scanned, arranged digitally. I can go into technicalities. I have 3 more minutes, so I'll go into technicalities because we're almost done. What we were looking for were it's kind of like a male-female condition, right? So we have 10 pieces, so we find a way where something takes something. And then, so once we find 2, we look through the other 8 pieces to find the third one, so that they essentially do that. A couple of other things that we looked at, and you can actually, which is kind of interesting, you can actually see it there. The ones that are straighter perform much better than the ones that are flayed, kind of like flattened. It's just because it acts as a column, whereas the bigger ones really like, you sit on them and like, oh, but it's okay, you can sit on them. Like eventually it's, don't sit on them. Do not sit on them. But it's something that we've learned, right? That the ones that go down faster to the ground perform much better. And it's almost intuitive, but the nature of things is that you try to do the least intuitive thing, because why not? So in trying to figure out the chair, the seat, I kind of went back. There's like, I have the luck of teaching is that you kind of collect million images pretty quickly. So, and they're like here somewhere. So went back to this kind of situation, that's kind of like the mass, because just from I need surface or mass. The sticks are really not comfortable. So looking at that, at the same time I had students kind of exploring mass. So it's kind of this, I don't know if this happens to everyone, but I've hated those, I'm calling them here, the Petra chairs for a couple of years because of like, I did them, I liked them, they did what they needed to do, and then I hate you guys. And then after 2 years, they kind of come back with what you've learned. So these are kind of the versions of the Petra chair, but they have difference in them. They're not just the thing in itself. There's the blue stuff that is squishier, there's the white stuff that is harder, etc. So I had a couple of students kind of looking at ideas of mass that is made out of difference. A couple of images, I'm just going to scroll through. So I should actually show you this first. So we've went for this idea of mass on top of the line, right? And it's just a resin seat. Because we have the scan, we can model it. Again, to show you the magic, right? It's always like, how did you do this? Two-part, I mean, from the videos that you guys should come back tomorrow morning and watch the videos that they put here. Because it's a simple 2-part mold. The pink stuff is just to kind of make the mold sturdier. And there's a pouring point. You pour some resin, and really that's it. And then just take it out. So we've kind of explored this thing that sits on it, that melts on it, which where did you find this story? People think it's tree sap. So that's what I'm hearing, right? It's kind of nice. Most people, I don't know what shama'. Shama' for me means something, but I don't know if they mean something else. But shama' seems to be, or wax seems to be the choice today. So a couple of these, this is the same set of legs. Looking at a couple of, for example, this didn't really sit nicely. It slid. So we kind of, what if actually it's kind of locks in? So this piece, which is not here, is not glued. And what the seat does, it kind of locks it together. So in this kind of, in our emails, kind of like the anti-IKEA. So you kind of like ship it in pieces. I have a quick brochure or a quick note on where things will snap, and the person can kind of put it together. These are the three that are there. Again, not good documentation yet. I'm waiting. I'm just going to scroll through. It's a couple of images, a couple of projects that we're currently working on, and like the dream of building big. So this kind of comes from the rubber stuff, right? So so the gold is really just color. We're looking at how can we use the rubber stuff as a screen. This is supposed to be a deployable bookshop, public reading space. Something like we're giving books, kind of like you give a book and someone takes a book, etc. Okay. We're also kind of working on a domestic project, a house project, where the client is asking us to take your time, take 10 years. I'm not in a rush. So we're kind of looking at, this is really early. This is kind of more developed, but that's kind of where we are right now. And I think that's it. Yeah. Questions, answers, concerns? Yeah, please.
To what extent do you think the limitations of the material or...
I can re-ask the question.
To what extent... Hi. Sorry, to what extent do you feel the limitations of the material or resources informs the work? And is that part of your practice or process at this point?
I might not have understood your question, but I'll answer something that I understood, which is there's some alchemy involved in this. Right? In almost all of this, there's some alchemy which kind of gets controlled to a margin. Right? So I know I can get this guy or its cousin if I want to. I know I can get any of those guys to a certain extent. So I wouldn't call it limitations. I think that I take issue with that word. It's just a material behavior, right? So I would say, yeah, the material gets thrown at me and kind of like it's a dance. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
To say thanks a lot for the talk. It was the first time I'm very familiar with the work, but it was the first time that I see you presented with the backstory, and I'm really interested in that. Faysal and I graduated from the same school, the A in London, so we sort of have similar ideologies. But what was interesting for me is that we kind of go about doing our work in almost the opposite way. We look at natural phenomena, we try to abstract that in algorithms, and then we figure out a way to fabricate these things using digital manufacturing or composites or some sort of material alchemy, let's say. While you find a material that you're interested in or is given to you and you start sort of assembling it in interesting ways, and I think that's a very sort of cool thing to look at from the audience perspective. I guess the question for me, and that's something that I ask myself as well, is to what extent can you go about doing this work without having it be in parts? Because, for example, one of the clear sort of projects that have an overlap between what we've done with Neil as part of the AA Visiting School Jordan is that we looked at the phenomena of erosion, for example, in Wadi Ram and Petra, and we came back and we developed a process of 3D printing using sand and additives. It's a very sort of similar outcome, but the process is completely different, and your intention was to actually depart from the natural phenomena and sort of create something that is almost natural. So the question, I guess, is the scalability of these things. At what point can we start thinking of these things coming in parts, and how do these parts not sort of ruin the vision that you have at the beginning of something that is natural and sort of heterogeneous and doesn't have those seams?
You know, so I went to Petra, again, for those who weren't here earlier, the first time I went was yesterday, in all my life. And it's funny because my image of it were two things. My mental image of it were two things, which is the khazna, right? It's like a postcard image, and but the specific part of the silk, right? The opening and the closing before the reveal, like the open, you're just walking in this way, two ways. What actually fascinated me the most was the moments where like, is this thing gonna slide? Because there's a huge, it doesn't feel like it's a singular mass. It actually, there are moments where it feels, it's multiple masses kind of like found their place and that's it. So in a way, maybe this answer is to scale up the part as much as possible, right? So there's a big mass and another big mass, and somehow that gap is designed. And I don't know if that answers your question at all.
The pavilion project that you showed at the beginning kind of does that, doesn't it? Or, I mean, I'm not sure if I understood fully the process, but it seemed like it is three. Yeah, there are four large parts, right? Right. Right.
Even though we've intentionally scooped on the seam. So even though we've intentionally scooped on the seam to hide the seam, so it's kind of like this line, right? It's a contraction joint. So maybe that's another answer, right? Maybe the parts come because of a real technical issue, like a contraction expansion situation, right? And then you just don't hide it. I've tried to hide it, but it's one of those like, oh, after you hide it, you go like, oh. It's like, it's there, why not keep it? I don't have answers. But
I guess we're both trying to figure it out.
yeah.
Seems that everything you showed us has very strong formal and spatial qualities that are natural looking. But if you can go back to the last two images where you tried to adapt that into an architectural building home, I felt that it kind of loses that, and it takes you back to, what is it? Actually, I don't know what I'm looking at here. So I wanted to ask you about the process of how you're thinking about this, for example.
Because of reality, of some way, shape or form, the constraint that I've given myself is the roof. Right? So that's the only thing that I can design. Why the roof?
Why not the roof on the wall of the space?
I don't know. Right? I'm honest about it. Like, I don't know. There's a thing that isn't shown here, which is the sink. This whole like kitchen island. This wasn't in random, right? So there's a version of this in the making to be a kitchen island, right? So this thing becomes closer to those. I don't have an answer, to be honest with you. Do you have an answer? Okay, please.
One more question, and then we'll have to end.
Sure. No, give it to
And I don't have a question. I have more of a comment for those who don't know Faysal. When we do the open call once a year, we get a lot of applications from Jordan and from the region. And this year, we got maybe 4 people applying to participate in Amman Design Week, and all of them use the same name. And so it's more of a comment than anything else, but I think that you are a true inspiration to all your students because all of them want to work with you. And a lot of them, you can spot them from a mile away. We get an application and we're like, that's an AUS student and that's Faysal's student. So thank you very much.